Okay, hello and welcome. Thank you for coming. I appreciate everybody being here. It's always exciting when people show up. I it gets to be right about 12. I'm like, is anybody going to come today? And when people show up, it makes me very happy. So thank you for coming. I just mentioned two things coming up. Next week we've got Nan going to be joining us. He's going to be talking about testing and production. I'm really looking forward to this talk. It should be a lot of fun. And then on Halloween, we will be using the spookiest talk I have, the Curse of the Testing Pyramid. Some of you probably remember this. If your team is struggling with kind of how much testing to do in different areas, we're going to try to talk about the the idea behind why we're actually trying to test to make sure we're not driving something based on the shape, whether it looks like a pyramid or an ice cream or what, and more on what we actually hope to get out of it. So anyway, those two things are coming up, and we'll be talking about the curse associated with some of the opening of the tombs in Egypt. So that should be fun. Okay, but today we're talking about coaching Agile. So I'm going to do something a little bit different. We're going to set up a scenario and kind of go through what that scenario looks like, walking through what a scenario would look like of coming in and trying to help an organization get better at producing their software. And give me a thumbs up. Can everybody hear and see okay? Is everything looking good? If it is, or thumbs down if you're having problems. Everything looking good? Okay, cool. Great. Okay, and those thumbs up and those emojis and stuff show up where I can see them and where everybody else can see them. So feel free, if there's anything that reflects how you're feeling at any time, whether you think it's funny or if there's sad face or whatever, feel free to just mash on those things. It makes it interesting for me and maybe for other people. And then we got a rabbit. That's great. Okay. Okay, so here's the company we're looking at. It's called Better Learning Inc. The existing version of their software was created in 2004. It's an education management platform, so teachers can put a classroom or what needs to happen in the classroom, give the assignments to their students, post PDFs and stuff for them. They enter the grades into this, and all these things happen. It's existing on-premise software. It's very hard to make changes. It's expensive to push changes to the client. And there's large startup costs for the school. So if a school wants to get on this platform, they've got to buy servers, do lots of training, bring it into where they're managing stuff. Just typically types of things you have with on-prem software. They've been very successful. They're still around since 2004, so that's a good sign for them. But they're seeing that they need to make changes in order to move forward. They attempted to do a rewrite about 10 years ago. The previous rewrite actually failed. It did not. They ended up scrapping it all. They've still got the code around somewhere, but they never actually deployed it. The development, they spent years on it trying to do it. Every story, they got to a point though where every story that they were creating created more bugs. So you deploy one story and say it was fixed, but then you create even more bugs that needed to be fixed in that. So it felt like they were going backwards. They never got to a point where anything could be delivered, where anything could be actually used by any customers. As they got into it, the developers suggested they rewrite. They're like, yeah, we don't think this is going to be a good foundation to build on. We need to just go back and start over after they've been into it for several years. And eventually the project was canceled. Now, just out of curiosity, not to give a thumbs up that this is a good thing, but if you've ever experienced this, right, would you give me some indication if you've experienced this or seen this happen somewhere? Okay, so this isn't, at least for Jake and I, this isn't a completely a sad face. That's a good one, right? This isn't a completely made up scenario, right? This is the type of thing that actually happens in software. Okay, so they're looking at a new version. One of the big things they're wanting to do is shift to the cloud. They want to make it web accessible for students. They've got lots of information that's in there, but most of it's not in a way that they can actually get the students using it. Students have phones and computers in ways that back in 2004 they didn't have access to, so they want to take advantage of that. One big thing that's important is they need to have higher quality. They're really concerned about the repeat of the last thing they did that they had to cancel, and it needs to be easier to change. They expect to make a big investment, and doing it right is more important than doing it quickly, but they also don't want another failure. So here's their plan. We want to avoid another failure, right? They want to create the right foundation. They want to use Agile to deliver this software. And they want to monitor this project more closely because they want to make sure they don't end up years into it and then discover they just have to throw it all away. And they also want to make sure that they've got the right people involved on the team and on the project that's delivering it. Okay, so let's look at our players. So first we've got Jill. Jill is the CEO of Better Learning Inc. We've got our development manager, John. He's also involved in this. And we've got our scrum master, Jennifer. And then we've got a development team. So here we've got Tammy. Tammy says this is her first development job, and she's very excited to learn. Then we've got Bert. Bert says that he used to program the mainframe using a magnet and sewing needles to flip individual bits. May or may not be true, but he's very talented and has lots of experience. Some of it he's had, and some of it he's made up. Then we got Molly. Molly says that she's been writing code for 15 years and can't wait to make this project successful with her team. Molly's exciting to work with. Then we got Ted. Ted looks a little bit concerned, and he's saying he's worried that we won't spend enough time up front to be successful on this. And then we've got Mike. There's Mike. And Mike says, I didn't realize we were going to be on video today. So there's our development team that we've got some of the players that we're going to be interacting with as we work on here. So here's a question for you. Which developer best represents you? Even if you're not a developer, which one of these, just click on the one that you think best represents you in as far as characters. Okay, we've got Tammy, we've got a Molly, we got some people over here on Mike, we got the worried Ted. No one's willing to click on Bert. He looks just too suspicious, and I get that. Okay, so the idea is these represent kind of different personas that you may have on a different aspects of things people you may see on a development team. So Jill is talking to everyone, and she's saying, why did the last project fail? So we're going to look at a few people, and John says the timeline wasn't based on reality. It was just made up dates, and so we never were able to meet a particular date. We were just making stuff up. So it wasn't based on what we could actually achieve. Jennifer says that the team couldn't actually deliver on their commitments. And so that's what she sees as being the problem, that the team never was able to, they'd make a sprint goal and never be able to achieve that. And then Ted says the timeline forced us not to invest in the proper runway and pipeline. So his perspective is that they were trying to go fast and deliver something, and that kept them from doing the investing and getting things set up in order to succeed. So question is, are all of these statements true? Or we'll put it up on the poll. Do all these statements contain some type of truth? Is there some level of truth in all these statements? And this is just a personal opinion here. And I will add the link again in case anyone needs it. Okay, it looks like 2% of us think the statements they made are false. But most of us think that they probably do contain some aspect of truth. And maybe we can all agree that even if they're for the... Oh, okay, we got everybody on 100% now. Okay. It at least reflects probably their idea of reality, right? They're not making this up. There are things that happened in the project that made those things be what they're thinking about. So what do all these solutions have in common? So just think about what all the things that they mentioned, what do they all have in common? They sound familiar. Okay. That's good. Blaming. Okay. Their waterfall, right? And that's what we're going to talk about is what do they imply? They're all based on people or resources or time, right? There's something we don't have enough. Time management. Very good. Lack of ownership. Poor planning. Okay. Arbitrary timeline. Yes, so all of them come down in one way or another having to do with the time. They do seem kind of defensive. Timeline. Identifying only one thing as a problem. So that's a good one, right? We may see the problem that may actually be just a symptom of something else that's happening. Not used to working in a team. Not clear on expectations. Priorities. Okay, so these are all things that they have in common. Miscommunication. One of the big ones. I may have something else. So if we think about those things, and I guess I haven't shown you the solutions they come up with. Okay, here I'm going to jump over here and then come back. So if we go through all these and say, okay, so she's asking why the project failed. The CEO does. John, the dev manager, says timeline wasn't based on reality. It was just made up dates. That kind of implies a particular solution. So he might say, with more planning, we could come up with a more realistic timeline. So that might be his solution to what he sees as being the problem. And if we ask Jennifer, she might say the team couldn't deliver on their commitments, and if we had more people, the team could have met their commitments, right? More people, we would have met our commitments, and then we would have been successful. Ted's saying timeline forced us not to invest in the proper runway and pipeline. So if we had more time to build the runway and pipeline without the stress of delivering the application, we could have been successful. And then we've got Mike, and Mike says we didn't have lucky slippers. If you get everyone lucky monkey slippers, there'll be nothing that can stop us. So there's Mike's perspective. So the thing, all these solutions, one of the things they have in common is that they're all looking for more resources in one way or another. And let me jump back here to where I found the slide that I meant to show. Okay, so how long will it take to discover if these solutions are helping or hurting based on what they were saying? A lot of the things that they're, and sorry, I gave you the slide before I actually told you what they were presenting as solutions. So think about that again. And if we think about a lot of the solutions that they're suggesting here, aren't things that in a few days you'll know if it's helping or hurting, right? If you take a team of 5 and say, okay, we're going to spin it up and we're going to get 50 people, it's going to take you a lot longer to figure out if that's actually helping you deliver faster. If you decide that you're going to do 6 months of building out your pipeline before you actually start working on the software, it's probably going to take you at least 6 months before you know if you're actually able to deliver better because of that. If you buy everybody monkeys, as a matter of fact, the monkey slippers are probably the one thing that you might be able to discover in a few days if it's helping or hurting or not. But most of the suggestions there of we need to do more upfront planning and a lot of that stuff, it's going to actually push out the amount of time before you actually discover how things are working. And some of them may push it out so long that you'll either get to the point that the project succeeds or it's canceled. And so what we want to think about here, let me jump back down to this, is how to get faster feedback. So solutions common. Most of these solutions don't actually help the team fail more quickly in small things so the project can succeed overall. So we want to think about how long will it take to find out if these solutions are actually helping. Okay, so let's jump. Now let's think. So there's our setup of things. And now let's talk about what is an Agile coach. So that's what we're going to be going through, is how would we come in and coach this team? We're going to look at some of the conversations that might start. I mean, as much as we can cram into the amount of time we have. So an Agile coach is someone who has been where you want to go. And I want to differentiate here between, I think coaching happens at every level, at every direction. So if you're working with a team and you're all trying to deliver on a product, deliver a piece of software, you ought to all be giving feedback to each other and helping improve each other. And in some ways, that is a type of coaching, right? You're trying to help each other regardless of what your role is. You may be a junior developer and you ought to be trying to help provide feedback that will help the team succeed. You can be a very senior manager and you ought to be trying to provide feedback and doing things that will help the team succeed. So there's coaching going on to help the team succeed that's going every different direction, and that's awesome. But if we look at who is somebody that you would bring in with actually wearing the Agile coach hat, you probably want somebody that's been where you want to go. You want someone that's been able to help, that's been on teams that have actually delivered software that looks something like what you would consider success. That becomes very important because a lot of the things that you may experience in trying to get to a successful outcome may be painful, and they may feel like you're going the wrong direction sometimes. And if you think about like a coach that's coaching a sport or something like that, sometimes the coach is encouraging the athlete to do things that at that moment in time are painful, or at that moment in time are actually make the athlete feel like he's slowing down. And without that perspective, without knowing that the person's actually been to the destination you're looking for, it's very hard to build that trust. And then the third thing I want to mention here is that an Agile coach should probably be someone, they do not have to be where you want to go, they need to know the way. Okay? I think what I would say, what I want to posit out here is that the idea that they don't need to have actually gone through the process and experienced it before, is there are enough nuances to successfully delivering software that if you have to choose between somebody that's had experience actually delivering software in a way that you consider successful and someone who has never done it but knows how to do it, the actual experience may be worth more than you're giving credit for. Now, it doesn't mean they've done exactly the same thing that you're doing. Maybe they've been on smaller projects and they're trying to do that on a larger project. But that is something that I think you should at least consider what the value of that is to your team. The other thing that I would suggest, the last one here, and some of these may be controversial, and you're fine to disagree with me. That's great. Things may be different in different contexts, or teams may be optimizing for different things. So feel free to put in the chat if you don't agree with anything. That's awesome. Someone that's skilled in delivering your application. This is something, if you remember, we had a couple people come in and talk about the Agile industrial complex here a while back, and some of the negative things, as Agile has become popular, some of the negative things that have happened. And fundamentally, Agile has been about delivering an application, right? And so what I want to suggest is if you're bringing in someone to coach your team or your organization that does not have any level of skill in actually delivering an application, you may not have someone that's able to see from all the different sides of what needs to be done. Agile is fundamentally about delivering software, and if it doesn't mean that the person has to have skill in every single area. You can have a conductor that conducts. Oh yeah, actually, I go into more detail on this other slide. Okay, let's go through these, and I think I mentioned what I was getting ready to say there. So it has been where you want to go. They may not know exactly what this particular team needs to succeed, but they should know what incremental success looks and feels like in order to help the team. They should be able to show you if you're getting the results you want. And I think that's going to be very hard to do if there's no experience in actually delivering software in the past. They ought to be able to deliver trust within your team. Knowing what to do versus knowing what to try. This is something I think is very important, because a lot of times you can, and like when I'm wearing my coaching hat, it's easy for me to try to tell people what to do. But that implies I know what the team needs exactly. And chances are I may have some very good ideas of what they need, but what I really need to do is focus on what they need to try in order to find the thing that's perfect for them, because this team may look very different than other teams I've worked with. Building trust by helping the team grow versus dictating what the team does. If you take some missteps and the team learns from it, and then everybody knows how this particular thing works, that's a lot better than somebody just telling them what to do and people doing things but not even agreeing with the decision that was made. The team should be willing to try something that the coach suggests, even if it's just to humor them. I've been in situations before where I've been working with teams. We built some good trust. We're working together, and I'm encouraging them to invest in something like behavior-driven development or test-driven development or mob programming, different things like that. And sometimes people are a little bit suspect. They're like, yeah, I'm not sure if that's really worth doing. But if I've got just enough trust that they're willing to try it, we can get over that hump, and we can adjust as we go, right? But the fact we're trying something new gives them the opportunity to grow and the opportunity for us to, as a team, be better. Okay, and here was the last point there. Skilled in delivering your application. Agile suggests principles that helps teams deliver software better. A coach without any skill delivering software will struggle to help a team improve delivering software. It doesn't mean that they can't help at all, but there are aspects of delivering software that if you don't actually have the ability to deliver software, may make it harder. Now, like I said, this doesn't mean that you can't have anybody coaching in any role, but you do need somebody help. If you're trying to coach Agile, you do need to have some level of experience in delivering an application. A conductor doesn't have to be a virtuoso on every instrument in the orchestra, but a non-musician is going to struggle to be a good conductor. Okay, so what does an Agile coach do? Well, let's jump into our characters we looked at and have some conversations from the perspective of an Agile coach. Okay, so here's Jill. She's our CEO. So we're talking to Jill, and here, if I stand like right there we go. So, okay, so Jill, what are you trying to accomplish with this new application for Better Learning Inc? And Jill says, well, we want to make our customers happy, but we also need to make sure we stay in business. Those are two very good things for a CEO to be worried about. So I'm going to say, okay, what do you see as the biggest risk to those goals? And Jill might reply, well, if we have another failure, it will really hurt our business. Now, keep in mind, Jill has said that two things: they need to stay in business and they need to make customer happy. Both of those things will be very impacted if they have another big failure. So how do you plan to mitigate that risk? And Jill says, well, everyone is telling me that we need to allow more time and use a bigger team. As an Agile coach, I hone in on the fact. I say, your body language seems to indicate you aren't particularly comfortable with that answer. And she says, it makes sense, but somehow it still feels uncomfortable. I want to trust my staff, but we can't afford to be wrong about this. And so as a coach, you want to say things that will get people's attention. Say, what if I can help your company fail more frequently? And she'd say, that sounds like the exact opposite of what we want to do. And so I might say it does at first, but it's actually the best way to make sure you succeed, and let's look at why. So let's kind of explore this idea here. So first of all, let's ask, what's your gut reaction to frequent failure? Is it positive or negative? If you have a coach say, hey, let me help you fail more often, what might you say? I'm going to check the comments here, see what people thought. And Richard, I did not take these pictures with friends of mine. That would have been fun. But no, I used stock photos. I didn't have time to actually pull that off. I probably should use my kids for some of these if we do this again. Okay, so 64% of us are saying that frequent failure is sounding like a positive. You must be doing training and going to conferences and listening to talks and really getting into stuff, because I think 20 years ago, that's not how things would have, people would have played out. But a lot of us, it's very much a negative idea that we're going to fail frequently. That's not something that we like all just want to run and embrace. But frequent failure is how teams learn. You don't want to avoid learning. You do want to avoid catastrophic failures that prevent you from adjusting based on what you learned. So rapid small failures turn into feedback. Okay, so somebody's pointing out that it's not necessarily more often, but just failing more quickly. Yeah, and I think that's a good differentiation. Here's an example. If I'm going to look at the road and adjust my steering every 10 minutes, so I'm driving down the road and I'm looking like, okay, I'm lined up. I'm good. Now I don't have to worry about for 10 minutes. I can go do something else. I just have to keep it because I've made my plan. I'm going to be good for the next 10 minutes. That is probably not going to give me the same results as if I'm going to constantly watch the road and adjust my steering as I go. I just realized, oh, that's cool. The green lets it through. Huh, that's funny. One of these is going to result in failure, but the other is going to take the same thing of looking at it and seeing, oh, I'm off track, and it's going to turn it into feedback. And so the rapidness of being able to take something and get the feedback from it is what determines whether it's going to produce something that's as bad as a failure, or whether those little tiny failures of, oh, I'm too far over to the right side of the road. In some sense, you could say that's a failure, but the real thing that's happened is you've got it soon enough that instead of it being failure in a negative sense, that little failure to stay in the middle of the road just gives you the feedback that you need to adjust to stay headed the direction that you want to go. So we're going to ask Jill, the CEO, what do you think will happen if we start with a huge team, start with a huge detailed plan, and invest months into our runway before we start working on software, based on this conversation about steering a car? She said, it would be like driving for 10 minutes and hoping we're headed in exactly the right direction. If we fail, we'd fail really big. So, right, we need to set the team up to succeed. There we go, that's me talking. Set the team up to succeed by giving them an environment where small failures can be used as feedback, to where it can help feed the learning process. She says, okay, how do we set up the team to succeed with small failures? Well, first we need to make sure that we don't make it catastrophically expensive to learn. So that probably means we shouldn't start with 50 people on a team. Right. If 3 to 7 people make a mistake that costs a week of salaries, it will be a fraction of what it costs for a team of 50. And she says, and if we wait to start making progress until we spend 6 months creating a plan, it'll be very expensive if it turns out our plan is wrong. Exactly. We don't really know if a plan is any good until we try to produce software. So we need to plan just enough that we can get feedback on our ability to plan. So inexpensive learning. Some things that make learning inexpensive is starting with a small team where you've got a little bit more flexibility to adjust. Making sure you've got a low burn rate. Like the example of 50 people versus 3 people, you have a lot more buffer to learn things when you're dealing with a smaller, and I'm just using 3. You may need more. I'm not saying you have to be a team of 3 people, but just the extreme large teams are going to have a much higher burn rate. You don't want to defer making progress to do more planning, because if you spend too much time making planning without getting feedback on how your planning's going, you may not end up where you're trying to go. And you also need to start asking yourself, what does it mean to make progress, to make sure you're prioritizing that? So, question for you, just in your experience, how would you rate, how expensive is it for your team to learn? So if you discover something's not working well, Is that an expensive thing or a fairly inexpensive thing? And I see in the chat the idea that it's not really failure, it's more of learning. What I'm trying to suggest is oftentimes the difference between it being a learning experience or feedback and it being a failure is how big of risk you're taking each time. If we take small risks, then it's learning and feedback. If we take big risks, it can be catastrophic for the team. Let's see anything else here. Let me see. And Richard, I think what you're saying about it needs to be more quickly, not more frequently. If we're actually reacting to feedback, if we think of the driving on the road, we're going to be making lots of little things like, oh, I'm not where I need to be. I'm not where I need to be. So the fact that it's very quick probably matters, but you may actually have more of them than one big failure at the end. But your point is, I understand your point. That does make sense. That is a good aspect to think of. Okay, so most are saying it's moderately expensive, and what I want to just suggest here is if you're in a category where it's more expensive, where if you can imagine a way of doing work that small failures would be less expensive for you and let you more rapidly change, think about what it would take to make that step toward having less expensive failures or less expensive learning opportunities. Okay, so now let's go talk to John. John's the dev manager. And John's saying, I'm worried that upper management is going to pick a date and expect us to deliver regardless of how long it actually takes to write the software. And I would say that sounds like a concern that is rooted in experience. And John says, yes, software is always going to take longer than you think. I know all my developers are going to work hard. We can't ask for anything more. Well, there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, but do you think it's unreasonable for management to want to know when the software will be done? John says, maybe not, but I don't know what to tell them. It will be done when it's done. Do you think they would be more comfortable if we could give them more evidence of our progress as we go? And John says, we always report the percentage we are complete, but they don't trust it. So why don't they trust those reports? Can't they use it to figure out exactly how much time is left in the project? And John says, sure, they know when we are at 50%. They know when we are at 50%, we have done half the work. So management knows that the second half will always take as long as the first half. Well, theoretically, yes, but in practice, the second half always takes 2 or 3 times as long as the first half. And that is if we are lucky. So I would say, well, can you see why management might not trust the reports? And John may say, yes, but what else can we do? I feel like I'm in a fight to prove that my developers aren't being lazy. And my first assumption working a team is that I'm sure the developers are not lazy, but what if we could make their work more efficient and more transparent to upper management? And what you notice what's happening here, John's got some very, very good concerns, very, very valid. But he's addressing things that upper management has that are also very valid concerns. They don't know it's a black box how things get done. They're not getting the transparency they need. And there are ways to resolve that, but if we don't, and this is one of the roles that the Agile coach can play a lot of times, is helping shift what we're looking at to where it's a way that satisfies both of the needs of what upper management is asking for and what John is looking for. So John says that would be great if there'd be a way to do that. It's like, okay, so how is your team measuring progress? And you'd likely say the features that they have coded, right? The software that they have done. Like, okay, so does that represent all the work? And John would probably say, well, no, the code also has to be tested and has to be deployed. And so I'd ask, well, does upper management consider the code being tested and deployed to be part of what needs to be done to count as progress? And John would probably say, they haven't said that, but I guess that might be why they don't trust our percentage done numbers. What if you were to change your definition of progress to be code that is tested, deployed into production, and is in use? John says it might align our expectations, but it wouldn't look like our developers were getting anything done for a long time. But right now, it sounds like you're reporting progress when there's still a lot of hidden work. This is creating surprises, and not everyone appreciates surprises. John says, well, that's true. No one likes surprise hidden works. So this idea that we're talking around here on the idea of the definition of progress is we really want to measure our progress in ways that includes everything necessary to get functionality into the user's hands. If there's something outside of that that has to be done, it's probably going to be hidden work and is going to create this disconnect between developers feeling like they're busy and the dev manager feeling, I know my people are busy, and other people saying it doesn't look like we're actually making progress. If development takes too long, fix the problem rather than hiding the work. So John brought up the idea that if we have to do all this stuff, if all that's included in our definition of done, or what we want to refer to as progress, it might take a long time. Well, the solution to that is fix the process so it doesn't take so long. The solution is not, well, let's just take this piece of work out and hide it over here so it feels like we're making progress. If you're headed to another town and it's going to take too long to get there on your bicycle, just going halfway and saying we're there when you're not actually there is not a working solution. Maybe you need to get a moped or something. You've got to do something else in order to fix your process other than just changing your definition of when you're done to something where you're not actually done. If functionality isn't tested, you have no idea whether it's complete or not. If functionality is not deployed, you don't even know if it can be deployed or not. There may be situations where you write all this code and it turns out you can't deploy it. Security scan fails, or it's just not deployable in the cloud but works on everybody's computer. Does your definition of progress include everything required to get it into the hands of your users? So think about what you consider progress, what you're measuring as being done, what's your definition of done, and does that include everything that gets it all the way to the hands of the user? And one of the ways to think about this is it still on the board? Are you still tracking the work all the way through until users say, hey, this made my life better? And this can be a very difficult thing to do, but I would suggest that the closer you can get to what we described there, the more transparency you will have and the better feedback you'll have on adjusting your process to deliver more rapidly over time and more efficiently. Okay, let's... The third option, we have no definition of done. And that is, you are in good company, right? There's a lot of places where that's just the way things are now. And oftentimes if you ask people, they may have some idea, and some of it probably overlaps and some of it diverges. But the real thing you need to do is make sure that you're not feeling like you're not getting stuff halfway done. Like imagine a factory producing cars, but everybody's got a different idea of whether the car is done. So you've got this huge stack in the parking lot of all these cars that are almost ready that you could sell them to a customer, but none of them are actually in good shape that you could sell to the customer. Okay, let's go on and let's talk to Jennifer. So what's Jennifer doing here? Do you mind me asking what you are doing? And Jennifer says, I'm practicing telling my team that they aren't meeting their sprint commitments. And just in case any of you wonder, this is how Scrum Masters practice, right? They get Teddy Bear and talk to him. So we said definition of done versus definition of progress. I would say those are very related. I kind of use them a little bit interchangeably, but the idea of is if you're not counting something as progress, whatever your definition of done is going to be the point that you say, oh, we've made progress because we're done with this. So I'd say that they're probably very, very overlap. They overlap quite a bit and probably really represent the same thing. If we say that we are 10% done, it probably means that we have declared 10% of the items to be finished. And whatever our definition of done is going to be how we declare that. But you are right. We kind of use those terms back and forth. Okay, so she's practicing telling her team that they aren't meeting the sprint commitments. So I'm going to ask, and how's that going? And she says, not very well. They say they're doing their best, and she gives it a hug. And so this has been a lot of the Scrum Masters I've met are this type of person. You know, I'll tell you you're not doing it, but then I'll give you a hug. I said, what if we could find a way to help them be successful? I said, I like that idea. What can we do to help them? So tell me about your daily stand-up. What goal is achieved by having your daily stand-up each day? And Jennifer says, each developer tells me what they did yesterday, what they did today, and if they have any blockers. And I'm going to ask, and does that help them succeed? And she says, I don't know. It certainly shows that they are busy, but everything takes so long to finish no matter how busy they actually are. So what could happen in the daily stand-up that would make the team more successful? And she says, if they could figure out how to actually finish some of the stories they are working on, that would be more successful than what they're doing now. Oftentimes we get to the end of the sprint and we have a bunch of stories that are almost complete, but nothing is actually done. Kind of like the cars we were talking about earlier. So what would be a step toward failing less than delivering nothing? So how can we take a step to have fewer of those failures of not delivering anything? Jennifer says, well, delivering even one story would be better than delivering no stories, because it does show that you made some type of progress. Okay, how can we change the way you do the daily stand-up to increase the chances that some of the stories will get completed during the sprint? Jennifer says, I guess if we could put more effort into fewer stories, maybe we would finish some of them. So if you notice, we've just kind of come around to thinking about work in progress limits, right? This is, if we really think about how to be successful and how we define being done with something, it kind of leads to that. So I say that certainly seems like something worth trying. How do you think you could do that in your daily stand-up? Jennifer says, maybe if we prioritize finishing a few stories instead of starting new ones. That sounds like a good idea. How would that play out in your stand-up? She says, maybe instead of asking the 3 questions, we could start with the story that's closest to being done and organize everyone around finishing that story. You should try that and see if it helps. She says, I will, and I'll let you know how it goes. And I say, great. Wait a minute, what's up with a gun? And she says, there are limited options of stock images. The only pictures I have are with a smile, a bear, and a gun. Okay, why don't we just stick with the teddy bear? So there's our conversation with Jennifer. So thinking about focusing on finishing, some of the ideas here is being busy will not bring success. And oftentimes our teams are very focused on being busy. And this is one of the big things I try to do as an Agile coach is make sure we separate between making progress, and their focus is on making progress, and less on how busy everyone is. Because it's very, very easy for everybody to be very, very busy. That's not a hard thing to do at all. But actually doing something that's valuable, that can be very difficult to do. And oftentimes focusing on things that are valuable can make it to where we're a lot less busy, because the valuable things may require us being there ready to take it to the next stage. So we may spend more time waiting to do work, but we're there to make sure that the work is never waiting to be completed. Okay. Finishing work is where we make progress, and work needs to be managed in a way that facilitates completion. And oftentimes this last point is what doesn't end up happening. So what is your team more focused on? Starting work, finishing existing work, retaining the ability to work from home, filling out status reports, or none of the above? What is your team more focused on? Seriously, C is only 5%. Some of the people I've talked to recently, that was like actually one of the biggest things for them. So anyway, what are you guys doing? What are you focusing on? Because it's really easy to be very, very focused on trying to bring more work in. And chances are that slows down all the work that you have that you've already started on. Okay, so let's go look at our development team here. Okay, so Ted is saying he's worried management isn't going to give us time to build out a good pipeline. So, okay, I gotta go over to move my thing, so I'm underneath that. There we go. Okay. Having the automation to build and deploy is very important. How do you think we can ensure we end up with a pipeline that does exactly what you need? And Ted says we should spend 6 months building our pipeline because we are asked before we are asked to write any of the application. And Ted's thinking here is that if we're being driven by the application, we might shortchange ourselves on the pipeline. So if we get all the pipeline stuff built up front, then it'll be in place and we won't have to think about it, and we'll have time to do it the way that we want to do it. So that might help with the first part of what we need, but at the expense of the second. And Ted's like, what do you mean? I said, well, we definitely need a pipeline, but just as important is making sure that it does what is needed. Do you see any risks in building the pipeline separate from the application? And Ted says, well, I guess we could end up building a pipeline that isn't a good fit for what we need to build and deploy. That's a good point. You might also find that your application starts evolving to accommodate the pipeline instead of the other way around. And these are not hypothetical things. These are things I've seen teams do, even for the best of intentions, right? Of saying we really want to focus on our automation, but doing it separate from being driven by the application. And you can easily end up with something to where your application is being driven mostly by how you set up your pipeline and much less by how should the application evolve. Ted says, okay, what do we do about it? Not having the time to work on the pipeline is a real risk. I would say yes. Do you usually create separate tickets for building out the pipeline? Ted says, yes, we want to make sure we track that work, so we create tickets for it. But why are you building the pipeline? Is the customer asking for a pipeline? Ted would say, no, not directly, but we need it in order to efficiently deliver the stories that the customer has asked for. So if the role of the pipeline is to deliver user stories, should it just be part of the user story that needs it? And Ted says that would make the first story take months to deliver. Said it definitely will make it take longer than if you skip the pipeline, but maybe not months. So what's the smallest first user story you could possibly start with? So Molly says, how about we build out the data model for the application, right? Let's get all the data model built out. That'll be our first story. As a developer, I want a data model for the application. And I'd say, we definitely want a good data model, but is the customer asking for a data model? And no, they're not directly. So what is the smallest thing the customer might actually be able to experience on the application? Now Bert speaks up and says, how about being able to create and manage their accounts? I say that's definitely heading in the right direction. A user can definitely experience being able to create and manage their accounts. But can we get any simpler? Is there anything we can do any simpler than this? And Bert says, what if we just create the login page? And I said, that's a good simplification, but just for the sake of argument, could we go any smaller? And Tammy speaks up. Remember, Tammy's the new developer. She says, I've got an idea, but it sounds stupid. Well, we're just brainstorming to see how small we can get to the first story. Don't be worried about how it sounds. Let's just hear all the ideas. And Tammy says, what if we just put the name of the application in the title of a page? And Molly says, yeah, but what good does that do? And Bert says, yeah, that's like 15 seconds of work. And Tammy goes, I'm sorry, I told you it was a stupid idea. So, Tammy, you may be onto something, but first let's address Bert's concern. Bert, will it really take 15 seconds? Sure. See, I wrote the page of HTML while we were talking, all 6 lines of it. And I'd say, okay, so if that story is done, how has it changed the user's world? Well, they can see the name of their application now. Where would they go to see the name of their application? Well, we'd have to deploy it. And Ted speaks up and says, and that is why we need a pipeline. And say, right, but we can't really call the story done until we've got it tested and deployed. And we can't deploy until we've got at least part of the pipeline in place. But will it take a month's worth of work to write a pipeline that can deploy Bert's HTML page? And Bert says, we can write code. Oh, wrong. I need to spell check this evidently. We can write code to deploy my HTML in 30 minutes. Ted says maybe 30 minutes for the deployment code, but we've got a lot of setup to do. It'll still take a few days. And the point is, it might even take a week or two, but when you're finished, there isn't going to be any hidden deployment work or hidden pipeline work that still needs to be done. And Tammy says, so just doing the title first was a good idea? And Ted says, it sounded way too simple at first, but if we include everything we need to get it deployed, it's a reasonable amount of work for a story. Good thinking, Tammy. If our progress is defined by delivering usable software, we want as much of our efforts to be represented by user stories as possible. Work that happens outside of user stories makes it harder to see our progress in terms of delivering the application. So, user story focused work. We want to try to organize and deliver your work in slices that have meaning to the users. Because if we're not being driven by what something the user is asking for, it's very, very, very easy to create stuff that turns out not to be needed. I was talking to the chief operating officer of a company that they've got some developers. He's like, yeah, the developer goes and works on all this stuff and then comes back 2 weeks later and they built all this stuff, but it's not what we actually wanted. And the reason is because the way they happen to be working is not driven by here's the story specifically we're trying to solve for the user. They've got a lot more latitude to do the other things that they think they need to do that isn't driven by a user story. And as a result, they end up with lots of waste. One of the things that I've seen happen a lot, and people legitimately point out and say, yes, but it would be more efficient. We could write a lot less code if we build out the data layer first and then built this other layer first, because then everything would be there and ready for us to use it. And we wouldn't have to change anything. I guess what they're really saying is if we do it this way, we won't have to come back and change stuff later. And that is absolutely true, right? If you're doing things incrementally, you're going to write a line of code and come back to it the next week and tear it out and replace it with something else. You may start up with a really simple database like Dynamo or something like that, and the next story comes through and you tear it out and replace it with a relational database. Those types of things happen. And you are throwing code away in some ways. But the cost of building the wrong thing or building something that turns out you don't need is so much greater than what you save by not iterating over it. So that's where the user story focused becomes very, very valuable, because it helps constrain you to where you're laser focused on exactly what you're delivering to the user, which means it helps you see it helps you put so many other things out of scope, and you'll come to those and evolve into those as the user stories drive you to them. If a user can't experience the story, it might indicate it's not sliced correctly. You don't want to hide work outside of the user story. And if it seems too big, try to find a way to slice it down. Even if you slice things down to where they seem just silly stupid in the way that you slice them, if you've got all this other work that goes into your definition of being done for it, you can have something like, Bert wrote those lines of code, 6 lines of code in 15 seconds. No big deal. Didn't take him very long. But all the other work of getting that first story deployed is going to make it take several days. It may even take them a week. It may take them 2 weeks. But if they were to say, we're going to write 2-3 weeks worth of code and then try to deploy it, it would be much, much more complicated to deploy, so it would take even longer. They may discover things in the deployment process that influence how they want to actually write the code. If you start with something small and iteratively deploy it, you lower your risk in those areas. So work that happens outside of user stories makes our rate of progress less transparent. When we aren't transparent, it makes it harder for the organization to prioritize what they are asking for. And Ted says, but eventually we'll have the pipeline built, so we won't need to have that work as part of each story. And Molly, with her years of experience, says, I haven't ever seen an active development project that didn't need the pipeline to evolve. And Ted, the amount of pipeline work may eventually be a lot less, but as Molly pointed out, as long as you're growing the application, you'll likely find things that need to change in the pipeline. But if you do get to the point that the pipeline requires less work, what will that do to the project? And Molly says it probably means that future stories will take less time than the first stories. Or at least the pipeline, or at least the time working on the pipeline. So, right, and maybe that means we take on stories that have more code than just having Bert write 6 lines of HTML. But we're setting ourselves up to deliver more functionality in the future in less time. Which is a good thing to do, right? It puts us in a position that we may be able to do faster or deliver more in the same amount of time in the future, instead of pushing off all this hidden work that means we'll be able to deliver less in the future. So we want to avoid hidden work. We want to make sure that our stories contain all the work necessary to get that piece of functionality to production. We want to build trust by delivering smaller things more frequently, and we want to bring deployment risks forward, but still in a way that's driven by user stories. So instead of bringing the entire pipeline forward and trying to work on that, before we do any development work, we want to bring it forward just the piece we need as part of each story that we're trying to deliver. Molly says, but projects always slow down when they get bigger. And I'd say, always? What slows them down? Well, you just end up with technical debt that makes it harder to add more features. And Mike's been quiet, I think he's been asleep, but he says, and every time you add new code, QA comes back a week later to say that something is broken somewhere else. Even my lucky monkey slippers can't fix that problem. Well, what if instead of waiting a week for QA, you could get them to tell you about problems as soon as you made the change? And Molly says, I'd say you're living in fairyland. And at that point, I'd say, okay, let's all mob together on this first story, and I'll show you the gates to fairyland. They're called behavior-driven development and test-driven development. And that wraps up our conversation with this group of developers. And at this point, we start actually trying to deliver code. We get QA involved, and we start saying, okay, let's give some examples of what this very first story would look like. Okay, I go to the page, what should the name of the application be? And we start working through creating a test for it. As simple as it sounds, we then have a test that always makes sure that the application is correctly named and no nefarious actors have tried to switch the name to something that would embarrass the company. So trying to lower the cost of change. To efficiently evolve an application, the cost of change has to be low. This is where a lot of applications get to the point where they develop, and then you have to rewrite because you haven't invested in keeping that cost low. It's expensive to wait for QA to feedback after making a change. And worse, and one of the things that makes it expensive is if I've changed a bunch of things and give it to QA and they get back to me a week later, I'm going to have no idea what was actually broken. The 5 lines of code that I changed, I'm going to be looking at maybe 500,000, 5,000 lines of code that changed, say, okay, why did this thing break? So instead of just looking at what changed to try to find the problem, I'm basically having to look at the entire application. Test automation as part of the development work is an upfront investment in future cycle time. So the first few stories you do, maybe in the first few months, the testing is going to add a lot of overhead to delivering the story. But by bringing that into the actual time that we have for each story, we get a better idea of whether we're making improvements or not. If we push that time off and kind of have it as hidden work, it doesn't really let us reflect, are we actually able to deliver these stories faster? Is testing actually helping us? Or are we in a situation, because if we have it off as hidden work, we're not going to get the feedback from it because we're not actually looking at the start and end points for that. Okay, so hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to take a look at the chat here. Please do fill out this the presentation feedback. This was a little bit different. You feel free to dislike it. Let me know what you think of it because I'd really like to get some feedback on it. And let's check out some of the comments. I don't have a quiz today because because all technology was conspiring against me this morning in many, many different ways, and it didn't come together. Let's see. How do you address concerns with the validity of automated tests? Some stakeholders do not trust them and want manual QA testing instead. Oh, that's a very good question. What I've done in the past when we were working on extremely important pieces of software where they cannot be wrong, we kept the QA people were involved. They would help us create examples. And then when we were through, they would perform QA just like they always did, except for what they were really performing QA on wasn't so much the software as it was our automated testing process. So if they found anything, they went to the team and saying, hey, this thing slipped through. We didn't create an example for this, or we created an example and it didn't find it. And so in a nutshell, shift your QA resources from QAing the software to doing almost the same thing, but QAing the development process and the automated testing process. That way you develop the expertise, because you're right, you may not be good at it at first, and that gives you a way to start getting experience on making the process better. And good point about the exploratory testing. It's not like you can't do any exploratory testing on things. What famous example that I know of is Hawaii sent a message out to all these people on their cell phones, basically saying there's a nuclear attack, prepare to die. It wasn't worded like that, but that was more or less the message. What it came down to is this software had 2 buttons next to it in the emergency SMS sending location or whatever. And one was send a test message somewhere, and the other was tell everybody that or send a test message to everyone. The other one is send a real message telling them that they're going to die. Those buttons were very, very close to each other and evidently not very well marked. And so somebody just accidentally hit the wrong button. Your automated test isn't going to catch that. It's not going to catch which button, that these 2 things look very similar. But the exploratory testing and a real person going through it can find those types of things. So I think that's a good example of how you still need people looking at your application. But if they have to spend less time, if they can trust that the automation logs in as all different 10 roles and checks all 50 pages to make sure people can go to only the certain roles, and you develop that level of trust that the automated tests are actually doing that, you end up in a very situation where they can spend a lot more time looking for the human factors of things that the tests aren't going to be able to catch. Let's see. The idea of sprint 0, and I see somebody responded to that. Tell you what, let me stop my streaming here.